So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is the panel on China's Belt and Road Initiative, and we're so happy you're here. Also, doubly happy that so many people have heard what BRI and what it is. So, the Belt and Road Initiative, as you know, is widely reported to be the largest infrastructure project in the world. I'm trying to get this thing hooked on properly. And just recapping, China intends to invest $1 trillion over 10 years roughly in 70 plus countries to develop their infrastructure and put itself at the center of the infrastructure that's being developed to increase trade, increase influence, and to set up China for the following few years. The question really that is being asked is, so what really is the Belt and Road Initiative? And there are so many different ways that people have explained it. Some people think it's the equivalent of the Marshall Plan, where the United States, after the Second World War, helped European countries rebuild. And that left a variety of allies and national institutions. Some people consider the Belt and Road Initiative to be kind of neo-colonialism, where China lends more money than countries can afford to pay back and then takes over assets for which the money has been lent. Some other people think that the main reason for the Belt and Road Initiative, and you have this map that gives you an idea of where the road, to just explain, the commercial belt is the land connection, and the road itself refers to the maritime connections, right? And as you can see, there's an all-encompassing set of countries that China is developing the infrastructure in. So again, some people think that a major reason for this is the so-called Malacca dilemma, where if you follow the trade route, you see that the maritime trade all flows, I think I'm going to break something, all flows through this tiny strait of Malacca, right? So most of China's oil goes through that strait, most of world trade passes through that strait, and so the thought also is that China wants to expand alternative routes so that it's not all dependent on the strait, which can be closed in time of conflict. So what really is the Belt and Road Initiative? Is it part of a grand plan, a grand strategy that China is developing? And what we want to do today is unpack all of this, right? All I can add before our panel, which, by the way, if you wanted to have and understand BRI, this is the dream panel that you would put together, that the Foreign Policy Association has. And I'm going to introduce them in a moment, but I thought, China's deadly serious about this. I myself think that this whole Belt and Road Initiative is going to work, and I think that it's going to change a lot of things, which we'll hear from the panel about. I just wanted to give you a personal anecdote. I spent most of May in Singapore and had to go to Shanghai for a meeting. I didn't have a visa. And this is just as an impact of what's happening in geopolitics today. So I went into the Chinese embassy. They interviewed me, and then I filled out forms. And then they said, good, so that we'll give you a visa. It'll be $325 or something like this. So I was born in Bombay. I was back in Asia. We never pay anything without bargaining. And I said, hey, I'm just a poor professor. Do you think we can do something about this? And this man looked at me and he said, Kashmeri? And he held up my American passport. He said, it's not who you are, it's where you're from. And I thought that was a very interesting message to deliver. But then he said, how about if I give you a 10-year visa, multi-entries? And I said, great, so I now have a 10-year Chinese visa. So I'm going to now, well, before I introduce my guests, or our guests, let me just say that each one of them will have 4 to 5 minutes to make some opening remarks. And then we'll just engage you as an audience, right? I want to save my questions if there's time. If not, we'll just go into a discussion of what the Belt and Road Initiative is, what are the geopolitical ramifications, are there banking ramifications, all of that. All right. But before we start, I want to ask a question. Take a poll. So you've all been reading, I'm sure, that this is a Chinese century, right? The United States century was the last one. How many people agree with that? Show of hands. Not very many. Not very many. I want to specifically restrict this question and polling to our wonderful friends from West Point. So I want the West Point cadets here, show of hands, how many people think this is the Chinese century, the last one was the American century? Come on, guys. Come on, if you can face howitzers, you can face this question. Nobody. Well, that's a good starting point for us, isn't it? So I'm going to now introduce my guests, and they'll have a few minutes 4 to 5 minutes to make an opening statement, right? And in the interest of time, there's a full bio in the book. I'm simply going to give their titles in the order in which they will speak. So as I introduce each one, please go ahead and make your opening remarks, right? So we have to my immediate left, Mr. Ryan Hess, who's the David Rubenstein Fellow, Foreign Policy Center for East Asia Policy, Thornton Center, Brookings Institution. So go ahead, Mr. Hess.
Well, thank you, Sarwar. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all today, and I also want to thank the Foreign Policy Association for organizing this event. I'm going to try to be both efficient and slightly provocative with my remarks in hopes that it spurs a conversation amongst us, because my main interest being with you today is to hear from you. There's a popular narrative, and Sarwar alluded to this, that the Belt and Road Initiative is part of a grand plan, a master strategy by China to dominate the world, displace the United States, buy off foreign leaders, and establish itself, root itself inside other societies. The director of the Central Intelligence Agency made essentially this argument earlier this week, and she has plenty of company in making that assertion. Many think tanks in Washington, D.C. make similar analyses. My perspective is that with any caricature, there's an element of truth, but that caricature is a bit like drawing a Monet painting with crayons. It leaves a lot to be desired. I won't be able to draw Monet for you in the next 3 minutes, but I do want to try to put into focus a little bit more, from my perspective, what I see the Belt and Road Initiative as and as not. I'm going to try to tackle 3 questions with you. The first, is the Belt and Road Strategy part of a grand strategy by China to dominate the world? Second, does China have a strategy to use debt to create equity, debt for equity swaps, to seize crown jewels from other countries around the world? And then third, does the Belt and Road Initiative present challenges to the United States? So on the first question, is this a part of a grand strategy by China to dominate the world? My perspective, no, or at least not yet. And the reason I feel that way is that most, if not all, of the projects that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative come from the bottom up, not the top down. There is no master document. There is no map that exists that has a grand theme for the Belt and Road Initiative. What you see here is an approximation that is sort of post facto. It's a compilation of projects that either have been begun or are in the conceptual stage that fit within those broad lines. But the truth of the matter is that Chinese state-owned enterprises and recipient countries are the sources and of the pitches for the projects themselves. And the other truth of the matter is that there is no geographic correlation between Belt and Road projects and this map. The money that is used by the Belt and Road Initiative is scattered across the globe. And if you looked at a scatter plot, a lot of the funding goes to Latin America, some of it goes to Central Asia, some of it goes to South Asia, some of it goes to the Middle East, a little bit in Europe, a fair amount in Africa. My point is simply that, that there is a 50,000-foot level vision for the Belt and Road Initiative. There is not a concrete, detailed plan for it. The second question I wanted to raise with you all is, does China have a loan-to-own strategy? In other words, saddling countries with debt, and then when they're unable to pay that debt, coming in and taking the crown jewels in a debt for equity swap. A senior official in Washington recently made this case publicly, saying that there is a loan-to-own racket and that the United States needs to counter it. In my research, I've only been able to find one clear-cut, concrete example in which this has been the case. It occurred in Sri Lanka, in Hambantota, a $6 billion port that the Sri Lankans were unable to service the debt on. The Chinese said, okay, we'll take the port on a 99-year lease since you're unable to pay the debt. That's the example, or the exception that proves the rule. I can also find 75 examples across the world where China has rolled over debt, reconfigured debt, or relieved debt to deal with debt overhangs that exist. My view is that China isn't really aspiring to own a string of unsustainable infrastructure projects around the world. And this leads me to my third question. Does the Belt and Road Initiative present challenges to the United States? My view is absolutely. Whether it's the corruption that is fueled by some of these projects, the environmental degradation that results from some of the projects, the debt burden that is created on certain countries as a consequence of these projects, or, in my view, more significantly, the standard setting that is the outgrowth of some of these projects. All these things challenge fundamental U.S. interest. And the example that I would use to talk about standard setting is that the Chinese have sought to encourage recipient countries to accept their standards as part of the deal for being involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. And sometimes that takes the form of electrical power grids, sometimes it takes the form of rail gauges, and in the future, I think that it could take the form of 5G technology, which will create a comparative advantage for Chinese firms that will be in competition with their U.S. counterparts around the world. So this leads me to my takeaway, what I hope to leave you with, which is that if the United States is concerned about everything relating to the Belt and Road Initiative, it may lose the ability to influence anything. My view, my perspective is that the United States needs to become much more narrow and focused in scoping the threat and the challenge the Belt and Road Initiative presents to us, including by focusing on issues such as transparency, safeguards, and standard setting. But I really look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haas. Next, we have Professor Pamela Crossley from my neck of the woods up in Hanover, New Hampshire. She is the Charles and Alfred Collis Professor of History and Professor of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. And we are so happy you could join us, Pamela, so we add some historical context to this.
I hope you can hear me all right. I really enjoyed your comments, Ryan, and I'm probably just going to be presenting kind of a historical complement to some of the points you were making. I have a few historical tropes in mind that I frequently encounter when reading opinion, IR opinion, and I have a feeling that FPA may be slightly less afflicted by this problem of reliance on historical tropes than some others, but I'd just like to maybe do a little bit of a checklist to start out, and with maybe yes, no, or in between from the historical point of view. First is, of course, the implication of the Silk Road, and as you can tell by looking at the map, if you look at an actual map of the Silk Roads, it doesn't look similar in any way. You have to sort of misrepresent the history of the Silk Roads a lot in order to see them as historical antecedent to this idea of building infrastructural connections across Eurasia that will connect China in some way, material or financial or digital, however it is to happen. So Silk Roads, I think, is a poor sort of antecedent, and in fact, President Xi Jinping hasn't been using that. He's always had his One Belt, One Road thing. It was other people who came up with this idea. Oh, I see, it's the new Silk Road. Second is the idea, and this I see a lot, that there was historically some kind of a Chinese world order based on a tributary system, where supposedly this is a way of China it's putting itself in the central position in relation to countries all over Asia and also a few in Africa, and that in some way this has been a rehearsal for the projected effects of the Belt and Road Initiative. I just have to say, this I can dispense with quickly, there was no Chinese world order, there was no tributary system. This is a mirage. Historiographically, we understand exactly how this came about. But when people start telling you about this, be polite, but you can stop listening when they start talking about that. Now, third is, and this actually is something that there's a tremendous amount of interest in now in Australia and in China itself, and subliminally lots of connections, and that's the Zhenghe initiative, these 15th century voyages all through the Indian Ocean, all the way over to Africa. There was a time when this was taught in high schools and freshman history courses as some kind of an exploration before exploration, Zhenghe before Vasco da Gama. And so why on earth did they not continue to do that? These were very extraordinary voyages in their way, but they were not exploratory. They knew exactly where they were going at every moment. The purpose behind it was actually connected to trade. And so there is something to play with here in terms of representations coming from China and counter-representations from some other countries. The Ming, in the very late part of the 14th century, Ming had cut off foreign trade for various reasons. And in the 15th century, the Yongle Emperor wanted to announce that actually we're back in business. And so he sent out these voyages, and every place they landed, they would deliver the message. The great universal emperor of China wants you to know we're back in business. So here's some examples of what we've got. Give us some samples of what you've got. They left porcelain, they took back giraffes. It's part of the way that worked. This is not a completely a no, right? They're actually, in terms of 15th century international propaganda effects, charm offensive, right? There could be a little bit to that. The fourth one is, and this comes up in a subtle way, this idea of the century of humiliation in China. And that Belt and Road Initiative is a way of remediating the sufferings of China in this period. And that this is an important part of the domestic appeal of the Belt and Road Initiative. I think there's a little bit in this, but we have to take this long picture. From the 3rd century BCE to, let's say, latter part of the 18th century, China seems to have accounted for about 25% of global GDP, consistently, all the way through. And then in the 18th century, this went up probably to about 35%. It wasn't until the 20th century, not the 19th century, the 20th century, that China's contribution to global GDP fell to 5%. This is in the aftermath of the Second World War. China had tremendous sufferings in the Second World War. This is after the revolution of 1949. But probably more important, because we're talking about percentages, was the tremendous emergence of the United States in the middle of the 20th century as a country that's really occupying at that time about 55% of global GDP. So, of course, China's percentage fell. What's interesting, I see the projections now between 2012 and 2022, China could move from 15% of global GDP to 21%. That means China still has a ways to go before it would recover the position it had in global GDP for centuries and centuries, I mean literally millennia. before the 19th century. On the other hand, what happened to China in terms of the unequal treaties and predatory lending from abroad, the ways in which commercial relationships were negotiated, there is a bit of a model in there, China having been on the receiving end of some of these practices, to the extent that they can be adapted to 21st century. Everybody knows they're useful because we can look at Chinese history and understand what happened to China in that period. Overall, I would say what's really going on with the Belt and Road Initiative in the 21st century is literally unprecedented. This is the first time that China has found ways of transferring some of its liabilities from the domestic sphere to the international sphere. It's the first time that China's put itself in a position of being ready to pump lots and lots of money, mostly in the form of credit, into the international sphere. I think overall, the immediate future of this, not as a lot of building projects, but as the creation of a lot of financial relationships, and in a few cases strategic relationships. I think this is really unprecedented. There's no need to look at history and find out what China's ambitions are. I think this is something that will follow globalization. This is the ability to define spheres of interest, competitive spheres of interest. And the EU clearly sees it that way. They're responding with something fairly similar of their own, this Asia connectivity thing. They want to use some of the same practices, but perhaps with environmental protections built in and so on. The United States is not responding. That's the problem of the United States. I think this is unprecedented. It is something that follows globalization, and in some ways China and the EU are leading the way.
Thank you, Dr. Crossley, and this is a wonderful segue to Dr. Alexis Crow, who is the lead geopolitical investing, who leads the geopolitical investing practice at PricewaterhouseCoopers. So, Dr. Crow.
Thank you so much, and honored to be on such a distinguished panel and to have you all here and those from West Point and students. And so, oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, great. Sorry. Thank you. I think in the interest of time, what I wanted to do is kind of take more of an economist standpoint and say, taking a big macro view and saying, okay, what is the demand for infrastructure? We're talking a lot about the projects themselves, but what does the whole environment and the ecosystem look like today? So the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, has forecasted that in Asia Pacific alone, $26 trillion will be needed over the next 18 years to be able to fund infrastructure in the region. So that's $1.7 trillion every year. So there is a great need for infrastructure projects across developing Asia. And if we look at some of the fastest rates of economic growth in the world, these are happening in Southeast Asia. So particularly looking at moving beyond rich income Asian countries to middle income Asian countries like Vietnam and the Philippines. And if we look at by sector, where a lot of the investments are actually going in BRI, as Ryan pointed out, it's partly in utilities, in power, in renewable energy, in transport. So there's certainly a great demand for improving transport links. Singapore is the sort of exemplar sine qua non here of being, an extraordinary country or city-state, actually, that developed these extraordinary transport links. So the environment needs it. And actually what I see, I work with a lot of sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. So some investors who will not write a check for less than $100 million or 100 million euros. So what we're seeing in the fund management world, and these are funds that over time generate, wealth for the Californian pension, the Californian education system, etc. What we're seeing is a lot greater move into infrastructure assets because of the value that is created. So whether or not we're talking about an equity standpoint, or whether or not we're talking about the yield that one can gather from the Jaipur tollway, or tollway in Mexico, these are very attractive. So the private sector is starting to take a much bigger role with much larger allocations in the investment landscape. I think that has positives to it. because generally I've worked a lot in the private sector and the public sector, and I think that generally when there's dollars attached, projects have to be completed on time, they have to be made very efficient. So what I wanted to say is what I've discerned a bit when I look at BRI is it is really very much a project for the 21st century. So as Pamela pointed out, I think that this is not the Marshall Plan. This is not development aid. We're really starting to move beyond that. And so definitionally, again, there's a lot of confusion. So we hear OBOR as an acronym, BRI as an acronym, and we've talked a little bit about the geographical reach, but it is not an institution. It is not a regime. It is not a body of laws. So therefore, it's not like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's not the Asian Development Bank. It is deliberately amorphous. And I think Xi Jinping and his party have made it deliberately amorphous. That has its upsides and its downsides. The upsides are that this is not China's version of manifest destiny. That's not in the Chinese DNA, to go and impose Chinese values on other societies. It's just not there. And as I've heard from some African clients, they prefer this to the American route, which is and has been sometimes guilty of manifest destiny and imposing American values in an American-led world. And one African client put it very clearly. He said, you Americans, you come and put a contract down on our table and you put a gun to our heads and you say, sign it. Chinese, they come, they put a contract on the table, they say, sign it if you want to. So there's a word in Mandarin for what these relationships are, and it's renqing, which is human bonds, and really building human bonds across these spheres of influence. And if I look at it from the private sector side of things, where this reach is actually coming from, was if we go to the extraordinary export-led growth miracle of the 1990s and the 2000s, China needed a lot of resources and raw materials to be able to fuel that extraordinary export-led growth. So thus the genesis of some of the largest companies in the world in terms of revenue, which are Chinese. So I'll give you, somebody a guess. So what is the world's largest company by revenue? Anyone have a guess? So we have in 2017, so the final numbers of 2017, Walmart's number 1. State Grid, Chinese power company, is number 2. Sinopec is number 3. And the Chinese National Petroleum Company is number 4. That company has 1.47 million employees around the world. So what happened during these 2 decades was we established this private sector reach. And now I think what we're also seeing is, okay, where are we going to take that further? So China, in effect, internally and domestically is rebalancing from the export-led growth miracle to more of a consumption and services-based economy. So how can we use the reach and the human relationships that we've built in all these parts of the world to be able to generate domestic internal growth as well as profitable companies? And I think that's where we start to move. And so in this regard, I think, again, so it has its upsides that it's deliberately amorphous. The downsides are, I would say, as we get into some of the actual contractual basis is, they're not necessarily clear, the terms, right? And so Chinese entities can often not necessarily reveal what terms are. And so this is why I think Ryan and his group have trouble sometimes finding this. But again, that has its upsides and its downsides. And so I would say that where I see a very positive development happening is at the geostrategic and the geopolitical level, and that is with the involvement of Japan. So Shinzo Abe has highlighted in the past that he's going to create his own Indo-Pacific counterpart to the One Belt, One Road. And what we've seen over the last 6 months is Japan actually coming to embrace China in a very real way in joint infrastructure projects. And so I would actually argue that America kicking off this trade war has pushed Japan not only closer to Europe, but also to China. And so what we will see next month is Shinzo Abe is due to go to China. We're looking at potentially 20 to 30 joint infrastructure contracts being signed. Xi Jinping will also go in June of next year to Japan. I happened to be in Tokyo when Li Keqiang came, which was an extraordinary moment with a summit with Moon. I think that's real history in the making, and although Trump's summit in Singapore kind of overshadowed it, I think this was real history in the making, because when you put joint profit on the table, I think it's very difficult to fight people, and war becomes more expensive to fight. So I think it's very beneficial. At the sector level, what we're actually seeing is Thailand is the first kind of market where we're seeing these joint infrastructure bids being made. So Thailand has a whole plan. It has 10% of Thailand's GDP comes from tourism. So if you think about the burden on the airports, it's extraordinary. And if you've traveled through Thailand, you know that there is certainly a burden on the infrastructure. So there's a plan to develop a whole southeastern economic corridor in Thailand. And Japan and China are looking to come together to make these joint bids. Whether it's a high-speed rail network or developing the airports. Why some economies are happy to hear this is because they think that they can play the Chinese and the Japanese off of each other to get lower rates, etc. But what I actually think is from the private sector side, Japan has extraordinary prowess in being very, very profitable up and down the infrastructure spectrum, whether it's to do with plastics, whether it's to do with solar panels, whether it's to do with heavy equipment and machinery. And so I think at a moment when China domestically needs to be very conscious about budgets and balance sheets and improve performance and efficiency for some of these companies, this is a perfect moment. And I think also the last point that I would make is, just thinking about the durability. Dr. Kashmeri kind of highlighted he thinks it's going to succeed. I would say that the single greatest way for any of these infrastructure projects to succeed is by generating local employment. So that's direct and indirect. And that, I think, is the true sustainability of projects today. And this is something I think that China has grappled with. Some argue that China only creates these projects to be able to hire and source Chinese workers and create jobs for Chinese workers. But the real challenge going forward would be, how do you do this jointly? Shinzo Abe has highlighted very clearly that he wants to do knowledge exchanges and to drive the growth of knowledge-based economies with corollary with Japanese investment. And so I think to the extent that China can do that as well, that will be a great benefit. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Crow. And last but not least, Dr. Earl Carr, who is Managing Director of Momentum Advisors and also teaches a course on U.S.-China relations at New York University.
Thank you. I'm not a doctor. Just Mr. Earl Carr is fine. I teach a class at
Raise your right hand.
But I'm delighted to be here. I wanted to first and foremost thank the senior leadership at Foreign Policy Association, in addition to PricewaterhouseCoopers, for convening such an important meeting. I'd also like to thank all of the people behind the scenes who've made this possible, in particular Cole, Adam. It takes a lot to bring this together, and I just wanted to acknowledge all of you. I'd also like to acknowledge the 4 students in my U.S.-China negotiation class that are here today. I will seriously consider giving you all extra credit for being here. And last, I would like to thank 2 very good friends, Joseph and Mei Ling, who are here all the way from Shanghai, who flew in last night, who are here today as well. So when I think of Belt and Road, I think of 2 key drivers, and I really want to focus on that for my presentation today. Is what is driving the Belt and Road, and last I want to talk a little bit about the perceptions of Belt and Road, both by Chinese companies as well as how U.S. multinational companies and Western multinational companies view the Belt and Road. So I studied in China in 1998. And one of the greatest opportunities I had was to take a trip with my mother and my sister from Beijing. We took a train for 3 days, hard sleeper, to Xinjiang, and actually experience the Silk Road, what we call Silu, firsthand. And I love how Pamela's depiction of the Silk Road, because there's a lot of history that's involved in it, and it's part and parcel of trade, which I absolutely agree with. But when we look at what the Chinese call 一带一路, the Belt and Road, we have to think about it and put it within the context of what's driving it. And this is primarily driven by overcapacity. So China produces a lot of overcapacity, particularly in steel. So if we take one province, Hebei province in China, produces 200 million tons of steel a year. That's the entire amount of steel that the United States produces combined. If we take a look at how much all of China produced in steel from 2008 to 2013, China went from 500 million tons of steel to 800 million tons of steel. That additional 300 million tons, that's more than all of the United States and Europe and all the EU combined, how much they produce in steel. So you have this huge demand of commodities that need to be exported somewhere, and so China's, part of that strategy and calculus is where are we going to export our steel, our excess capacity. So that's one key driver. The other key driver that's critically important, and it's what Ryan alluded to, is rewriting how global standards are being implemented. And in particular, I'll focus on the railroads, as well as technology with respect to telecommunications. These are very real drivers, and it's really how China believes that it can essentially have a critical edge in utilizing technologies to export these technologies to better complement its internal domestic economy. So domestic concerns are primarily driving this initiative. I mean, China has a huge concern with the inequality of growth, and so it's a way for it to use the Belt and Road to particularly develop the hinterland, what we call kind of tier 2, tier 3 cities in China. Last, I think it's important to talk about perceptions of China. I agree with Ryan 100% that I think that there is no grand strategy. Working in the private sector, I had a call last night with a client that we're working with in Shanghai, and when you talk with local companies and you talk to them about the Belt and Road, there's so much confusion about what actually that encompasses, what that entails. There's no grand master list of projects, as you alluded to. There's no overarching kind of list where you can go and see every single greenfield project that's related to Belt and Road. And I agree with you, Alexis, that there's an element of kind of amorphousness there that's done by design for that in particular. When I think of Belt and Road and you look at kind of how Chinese perceptions and how they perceive it, you have kind of two trains of thought. You have those who are maybe a bit lesser educated, have less access to resources, and they're jumping into Belt and Road full force because this is what the Chinese government has mandated, and so they're investing in a number of these projects, and they're finding out earlier on that they're losing a lot of money in these projects that for lack of a better word, that they're required to kind of do this because they want to be in the good graces of Beijing. You have another group of Chinese that are more educated, that have better access to information, and they're learning. Does it make sense to invest in ports that only utilize 50%? And I'm glad you mentioned the port in Sri Lanka, because it's often brought up of how China utilizes this, the depth trap scenario. But what's interesting about the Sri Lanka scenario is that many Chinese companies use that as a model for how they should be investing. So our client in Shanghai said, look, Earl, bring us investment projects. We'd love to buy a plot of land. We'd love to buy a bank in Turkey or other countries, but give us investment ideas and we will pursue that. Where I'll slightly disagree with you, I agree on the kind of bottoms up approach. What I would say is that the Chinese government is guiding these projects, particularly, and I'll give you an example. Last night, our client said the Chinese government is very keen on us looking at investment projects, particularly in Central America, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. And we're getting our guidance, particularly in specific industries there. So I think that is one specific area on countries and industries where the Chinese government is playing a bit more of a hands-on role. In terms of perceptions of kind of BRI from I've talked about Chinese companies. If we look at American companies, there's this prevailing consensus that there aren't a lot of opportunities for American companies to invest. I mean, you've got your large multinational companies, that GE, that came in early, that were able to sign a kind of a joint venture with Chinese companies that want to export kind of cleaner technology. And I think that the opportunities are potentially great there. But there's also this growing prevailing consensus that there aren't a lot of opportunities for American companies to really invest in. As one American company CEO mentioned to me, like, we think we're going to get crumbs on the table with respect to this initiative, because in the final analysis, the vast majority of these contracts are going to go to state-owned enterprises. When we look at the current administration and how they view the BRI, the Belt and Road had this huge symposium in December. The administration said they weren't going to send a representative to represent the United States. They eventually ended up sending Matt Pottinger, who attended. But the overall perception is quite glim for what American companies feel that they're really going to be able to access and take advantage of with respect to BRI. And the last question that I'll leave you with is, in my mind, the critical question is, can companies and countries in Southeast Asia and broader parts of Asia really absorb the excess capacity that China is really going to export via this Belt and Road Initiative? And to be honest, the jury is still out on that. There are a number of countries, particularly within the last few months, have come out very forcefully in actually not, publicly saying that they don't really want to take advantage of the BRI initiatives. The president of Malaysia came out very strongly about being cautious about engaging in Belt and Road initiatives. You've seen India also be very cautious about taking part. So I think we're seeing an inflection point of how companies perceive this Belt and Road Initiative, and it's not exactly cracked up to what they thought or envisioned it to be.
Thank you, Dr. Carr. I just wanted very quickly to follow up on a couple of points. One is the engagement of American companies, right? And I sometimes think that China could validly claim that America is part of the Belt and Road Initiatives, right? I mean, very few of us know that when Boston went out to replace its transit cars, a Chinese company won that project, right? And in fact, took engineers from Massachusetts to Beijing, showed them how they were put together, opened a plant in Springfield, Massachusetts, created 200 jobs, and was roughly half the price of the next. There were 4 companies that bid, and they were half the price of the next company, right? Bombardier and all of these. So engagement with the U.S., I think that's a point that needs to be made even more. I've always been a skeptic about whether the United States will be able to engage with China on BRI, but I'm no longer a skeptic after President Trump's remarks at the UN yesterday. A president who's done more for this country than all the presidents put together since the country was founded. I now find myself an optimist that he will find a way to engage with the economy. So the other point that I wanted to touch on is this quasi-nationalism, colonialism issue. One of the examples that's picked up very often is Pakistan, that China will lend it so much money that it's going to sink because it can't pay it back. I happened to be talking to a former governor of the Central Bank of Pakistan, and he told me not true at all. He said the investment, to your point, Alexis, on power plants and infrastructure has already provided Pakistan with enough cash from its new exports, because they don't have the power fluctuation anymore, that they will be easily able to meet the payments on the $45 billion, which is their debt right now. So I just wanted to highlight those points. And let's open it up for questions now. Please. Wait for the microphone. Appreciate a short commentary before your questions so we can get in as many as we can.
So another kind of a paradigm would be that a lot of the concern is not so much about China, which sometimes people would kind of equate with the Chinese. I think there's a concern about the Chinese Communist Party, what the motivations of the Chinese Communist Party are, and the degree of control, the degree of power and control that the Communist Party obtains through this there's an analogy to the game of Go where you accumulate power all over the board and you avoid conflict because you look around and you're overwhelmed by all this power. How do the Chinese people, view the Communist Party, this concern about the Communist Party gaining more and more power and control?
Do you want a specific person to answer, or just open it up to the panel? Please. Alexis, I hear you, look at you and you're smiling. Go ahead.
Well, sorry. I do think that President Xi has come into power at a moment where China is going through the Communist Party is going through somewhat of an existential crisis. Because if you think back to the romantic origins of Mao Zedong, the countryside, the peasants, and then you go to Shanghai, there's a very clear cognitive dissonance. And so I think we are at this moment where the values that have been the very backbone of the Communist Party are coming into question. And you're starting to see there's more of a dialogue and more of a participation with Western scholars on this, which is, I think, refreshing. I think separate to that, so Pamela did mention that there is kind of this, sometimes some would say a wag the dog scenario, so like the island development, that this is something that's distracting attention from internally the need to rebalance the domestic economy as well as come into touch with this existential crisis and come to the other side of it. I would actually posit that China, just like America, has a military-industrial complex. And they need places to spend that money, just like we need places to spend that money. Because guess what? Bin Laden didn't replace Russia after the Cold War. So, we also have this. So I think I would actually say that, again, it's not in my understanding of reading Chinese history that it's in the DNA to be able to impose values or export values. I think where the government will come into tension this is something I see with like the case of Iran. When we had those protests over high food prices, and a lot of the placards in the Iranian protests stated, "Why are you spending money in Yemen? Spend money on us at home." So I think the government may eventually be able to need to clearly define how the creation of wealth outside of China is generating job growth and wealth creation and wage growth inside of China. So it's an interesting moment. I don't have a clear answer, but.
Please.
First, love the question and thanks for asking it. In my mind, I think that when I speak to my friends in China, and I took 2 trips to Shanghai this last summer, there's this implicit agreement that the citizens of China have given to the government and said, look, we will, in being the guarantor of the state, we understand that there's certain rights and privileges that will be taken from us, but we're willing to give that up in return if you can continue to guarantee higher levels of standards of living, ensure that the economy continues to be robust. And I think that that implicit agreement has taken place, but at the same time, as you have more Chinese that are studying abroad and are access to levels of resources and information, it's like once you let that genie out of the bottle, it's very difficult to put it back in. So they're going to demand, as they get higher levels of standards of living and as the economy improves, they're going to want more in terms of how they participate and how they question how decisions are made, particularly when you look at data and personal data that's being gathered, or whether it be on WeChat, et cetera. And so I think that there's going to be an inflection point at some point where people say, look, we want to have more of a say in how decisions are made, and I think that'll come.
So just a quick one, if I may. No, go ahead, please.
If I could just add one more spin to this question, I think it's a really important one, and I'm glad that you raised it. President Trump ran on Making America Great Again, and he won. Well, China also has a similar concept. It's the Great Rejuvenation of China's nation, which is the vehicle that Xi Jinping has used to consolidate power. This idea that China will rejuvenate itself to whatever past glory may or may not have existed. And The Belt and Road Initiative has been supportive of that because in the abstract, it's an easy vehicle for Chinese people to conceptualize as China becoming more and more central in the global economy. Well, that works in the abstract, but when things become concrete, there may be tension. And I think that just to get to the same place that Alexis was, but from a different path, I think we are approaching an inflection point on the Belt and Road Initiative because the first 5 years, this is a 5-year-old initiative, and the first 5 years we've been talking about sort of airy-fairy ideas of how to build these belts and roads around the world. It's becoming real now. And why were the Chinese so focused on Pakistan to provide proof of concept? Because they wanted to show that a project could work, that could deliver results, that helped the Chinese people, that relieved excess capacity, and that generated goodwill from Pakistan towards China. Well, that project is under an enormous stress right now. And the Chinese really don't have a lot of proofs of concept around the world to point to show that this is achieving the outcomes that President Xi has promised it would. And at the same time, there are increasing numbers of Chinese people, and this is visible in social media, asking why the Chinese government is spending so much money in places that are crumbling, like Venezuela and elsewhere, when there are real problems here at home that need to be addressed. And so I've been around President Xi a fair bit. I don't get the impression that he sleeps easy at night knowing these things that I just described.
So Dr. Crossley, I just wanted to get a historical, touching on this idea of the Chinese as they open up to the world, they'll come back with ideas that will make more liberal and more democratic. But I often hear that, it's drilled into the Chinese that a strong center is what's kept the country together. So that this idea that it'll become democratic and so on, is it wishful thinking?
Well, I wrote a book about that, so don't ask me to just answer in 10 seconds, but I think a strong but flexible center, maybe that's a very important part of it. But this question I understand to be partly about decision making and establishment of priorities as well as credibility. And I think the way historians really tend to look at this CCP, at least in the past 25 years, is that it is a political party, but really this is a set of interlocking social entities in terms of families, extended lineages, cross relationships across industrial and financial entities. This is a fairly well consolidated hegemonic economic and social class, and it is important for the president to remain credible in the eyes of that class. But historically, when you look at those kinds of phenomena, there can be circumstances in which there's just a peaceful evolution away. They just gradually sort of break up and it all seems to proceed. But that's not common. I mean, generally for those kinds of establishments, as we call them, to be dislodged, something cataclysmic generally happens. So it's something, I think historians would be very, very cautious in trying to talk. I can definitely tell you it's not a political party, but beyond that, I think this is a very, very complex issue. But in terms of establishing priorities, making decisions, the people we indicate when we say the CCP, I think will always be critical.
Go ahead, please, and warning for the West Pointers, the next question should be yours. And if you don't have one, I'll come and select someone, okay? Go ahead.
When you asked your question, I think everyone in the room responded about whether this century was going to be the Chinese century, except for the real experts up at the front of the room, and I'd like to hear their opinions.
All right. Show of hands. Is this the Chinese century? One. There you go. Sorry, this comes quicker than I thought. Please.
Sir, Mr. Carr, so you said this. Thank you.
You said this would be the Chinese century. How should the U.S. counteract this or respond to it? Or how should the U.S. accept it and adapt to not being the world power?
Great. No, that's a great question.
Great.
And I think it gives a lot of food for thought for my colleagues. I think that in many ways, there's a lot of ways that U.S. companies and the U.S. can engage with China. When I think of the Obama administration, one of the defining core mutually strategic objectives was the environment. That was one issue that the United States and China could focus on, and they did it well. And I think the problem where we are right now with this trade tariffs is that, at the end of the day, it's like two kids fighting in a sandbox. One kid pushes the other with one hand, the other kid pushes the other, and with one hand, then two hands. I mean, at the end of the day, you need to sit down and talk about how we can work about growing our economies together. I don't know if you saw the panel at CSIS where they had the 5 former representatives from the USTR sit down and talk about trade policy. I mean, I think that was, that's indicative. There's so much the United States and China can do to work to build bridges and to work on very important issues such as the environment, such as building common standards. I think to highlight some of the great work that Columbia University is doing on Belt and Road, they're developing standards by which when you do a BRI project, whether or not from an environmental standpoint is it in line with global standards of the environment. Other joint ventures like that, where Chinese scholars, U.S. scholars are working collaboratively to jointly build standards that can be used not just in the U.S. and China, but more broadly globally.
Thank you very much. Please.
My name is John George, and I'm representing Lord Abbett Investment Management. And I have a question related to ESG as our firm looks to move into that area. Alexis, I read your publication, the most recent one. I'm wondering how China is looking to invest in that area and become more aligned with the principles of responsible investment as it relates to environmental, social, and governance standards.
Excellent question. Thank you, and nicely follows on from Earl. So, world's largest investor in renewable energy is China, and by a long, long margin. World's largest issuance of green bonds is in China. And what I love about this is it's not just sort of pro bono, it's because they have to be, right? And if you look at, the desire to bring down smog in Beijing, this is for the health and the good of the people. And if you look even at the surrounding cities, again, there's just such a tremendous push to be able to do this. And, when you travel to Beijing, that's what the chat happens to be about. I have great hope that when China comes up with solutions like this, that they can export these solutions to India. Because we haven't even spoken about India today, but I do believe that the Indian economy is very much the next China albeit in a different pattern. India has a tremendous burden on its shoulders to be able to clean the air for its citizens, and to do that in tandem with Modi's Make in India manufacturing miracle. So to come to the standard setting, and this is something that I've actually urged Chinese companies to do, is to create the green gold standard setting, because you are the world's largest investor in renewable energy, and we saw that with President Xi's maiden voyage to Davos and his speech, where he said very clearly this can be outlined. So I'm buoyant and hopeful about it simply because there is such a growing demand for it. Also, if we think about practical applications of it, the Japanese and the Chinese have spoken about doing joint solar power projects together, which is, I think, a welcome development. And then if we look to Europe as well, we haven't really touched on Europe very much today, but if we look to Europe as well, that is certainly the one market where ESG and renewable is highly in demand, both from the fund management as well as the corporate side. And the Silk Road Fund, which is the private sector entity responsible for generating a lot of the investments, have actually done a joint investment mandate with the EIB, the European Investment Bank. They're also looking at doing standard setting with the EBRD, so the environment would come into play with the EBRD as well. So I'm hopeful, and I would see a lot of opportunities for your company.
So we'll take one more question. I know we're a little over time, but we're really reclaiming the time that was lost to us. But we'll finish. I promise this is the last question. Please.
I'm curious as to what you think the motivation might be from the Chinese government. Is there an overall motivation? You know, our FBI and CIA might say that it's a little different than just economic. And any ideas on that from the government's viewpoint, if we can?
So Ryan, you've been in the White House. What do you think?
As it relates to the Belt and Road Initiative,
Sure. Overall, I mean, that would be a part of it, I would think.
well, I think Earl captured well a lot of the motivations the Chinese have. They have significant domestic problems that they're trying to address through the Belt and Road Initiative. So they have overcapacity issues. They have too much savings that they need to find a way to put to productive use elsewhere so that it doesn't create inflationary pressure at home. They have the prospect of employment challenges, localized employment challenges, and this is a useful way, these projects are a useful way to saturate labor. They also have an aspiration for standard setting. And I think that from President Xi's perspective, I've listened to him talk about this numerous times. I think that he feels that this is a useful project to stoke national pride in China about forward progress and momentum that China is achieving. So I guess that's a long way of saying that there isn't any one single explanation of what the driver of this initiative is.
Well, that's all economic.
Well, I think it's also geopolitical in the sense that he does see this as a way for China to expand influence, to gain foothold, to gain leverage with other countries. We've seen countries that are recipients of Belt and Road Initiative funding are more inclined to vote with China at the United Nations, less inclined to publicly challenge China on some of the more sensitive issues to China, such as the South China Sea or the situation in Xinjiang or human rights issues. And so I think when you add that all up, it helps to provide a bit of context to what China is trying to achieve. As I was saying, or trying to say, this initiative is ambitious, it's bold, it's audacious, it's also risky. President Xi has associated himself personally with this initiative. It's his Belt and Road Initiative. And if it succeeds, then it will be a tremendous benefit to him and his legacy. If it encounters challenges, as projects of this scale typically do when they move from concept to implementation, it will be a more difficult issue for him to manage, including internally.
Thank you very much. It's time to wind up. I'd like to leave you with one thought. I've recently been thinking about the Belt and Road Initiative in the same way as the moonshot during President Kennedy's time. When Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 at Nazarbayev University in Uzbekistan, he gave his country a vision. He had no idea how it was going, I shouldn't say no idea, but little idea of how it was going to be implemented, the problems that would arise. When President Kennedy at Rice University said that America would land a man on the moon, I was studying aerospace engineering, and we all looked at one another, the students, and said, how can this be? We don't have the systems, we don't have the microtechnology, we don't have the material to absorb the heat of re-entry, right? He couldn't care less. He wanted the vision to go to America. So I would like you to just take away that thought and think about it. It'll be explained further in my book, so that's a sneak way of getting in the book. I want to thank Dr. Hess, Dr. Crossley, Dr. Crow, and now promoted Dr. Carr. Thanks so much for coming.